There's a method to the madness. There's a way subsidiary legislation are drafted. You have to first of all refer to the primary law that gives you power. So the same structure, we have four parts: preliminary, principal, miscellaneous, and then final. But the important difference between primary legislation and subsidiary legislation is the enacting clause. At the very beginning of the enacting clause of any subsidiary legislation, you must mention pursuant to section so of the primary act, because you are deriving your power from the primary act, primary legislation, principal legislation. So the first thing you do is refer, and don't forget, we don't draft omnibus. You don't just say further to the Central Bank Act. No, there's a section in the Central Bank Act that gives power to make regulation. Remember, under our miscellaneous provision, that's where we provide power to make regulations. So in your drafting of subsidiary legislation, you must refer to the section that gives you power to make regulations. Very important. That shows you understand how this thing works. And the reason you are giving power to make subsidiary legislation is Parliament may be too busy because of time. They cannot be making detailed regulations under that law. So they give the minister or another agency the power to make regulation. Another difference between primary legislation and subsidiary legislation is that there's a requirement that subsidiary legislation only takes effect, the commencement date is the date it is gazetted. In Lesotho, after it's drafted, it is submitted to Parliament. Within 15 days, Parliament can approve subsidiary legislation or decline it. So you have 15 days within which Parliament can accept that subsidiary legislation or refuse. Now, in Nigeria, the commencement date of every subsidiary legislation is the date when it is gazetted. Gazette means the official journal of the government where all notices are published. So until that notice is published, nobody, that subsidiary legislation does not have effect. Another unique, very unique feature of subsidiary legislation, which is peculiar to the United Kingdom, is called King Henry VIII clause. King Henry VIII is or was a king of England, because in England the king has to sign assent to all laws before they become effective. Now, the man was tired of every day new laws he has to sign. Every day he has to sign. So one day he made a law that it is not every law you bring to me. I am going to give you power as a minister under certain laws. For example, the Immigration Act. I'm going to give you the power as a minister to amend the primary legislation without coming to Parliament to tell them, oh, approval. Because just as in Lesotho, in the United Kingdom, all subsidiary legislation must be laid before Parliament. Now, but the exception is there are certain primary It is a requirement concurrent laws. It gives power to the minister to pay in Lesotho. It takes effect 15 days after it is laid before Parliament. It's a mandatory requirement of your constitution in Lesotho. No subsidiary legislation takes effect unless it is laid before Parliament. And then within 15 days, the Parliament will either approve or disapprove. So you can see the uniqueness of subsidiary legislation. The purpose is it provides the details for implementation of that law. Oscar, when you copied this thing, try and copy it completely. You said in the United Kingdom, some primary legislation contains Henry the Eighth. Is Henry the Eighth? Yes, coming, not Henry the Five. You know they are kings. They have different names. King Henry the Eighth is different from Henry the Five because there was also a Henry the Five, King Henry the Eighth. See how I've put it there. These are tiny details, but it makes a difference. It was Henry the Eighth that made that law that gave power to ministers to amend primary legislation without the necessity of coming to Parliament. So,
Prof, it's Henry the Seventh you wrote.
okay. Instead of Henry the Eighth. So it's Henry the Eighth, King Henry the Eighth. So these are unique features of subsidiary legislation. So there are different kinds of subsidiary legislation. There's executive orders. In our constitution, we have proclamation is when the president can proclaim a state of emergency. Section 305 of the Constitution of Nigeria is a form of executive legislation. The Constitution has given power to the president. Ordinarily, the president is not a lawmaking institution. So subsidiary legislation means lawmaking powers are given to persons who are not lawmakers. That's the meaning of subsidiary legislation. So in our constitution, proclamation is an example of a subsidiary legislation made by the executive based on power given to them by the legislature. Then you have rules of courts, federal high courts, civil procedure rules, National Industrial Court of Nigeria, civil procedure rules. So those rules of court are made pursuant. The primary legislation may be high courts of the Federal Republic of Nigeria or Federal Capital Territory. The chief judge of that high court will make the rules under that. So the Court of Appeal Act also empowers the president of the Court of Appeal to make rules. Then you have the Supreme Court Act. It also empowers them to make rules. So it's good you know these differences. Then you have, there are other bylaws are the laws made by local governments area legislative council. Okay, then there are notices. You cannot mix up all these are technical names for different types of subsidiary legislation. So it depends on what you're doing, you stick to it. Any questions? So today we're introducing this. In the course of the week, we'll look at different types: executive order, rules of courts, any questions? For the short time we have left, let's take questions. Questions? Yes, Akinjo.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. I listened to what you said with regards to the subsidiary legislation. Also, to that when you make that law subsidiarily, you will have to return to Parliament within 15 days to get it approved. But for Nigeria, you only need to go through Gazette. I actually want to you to talk more about that Gazette. That's number one. Then number two, I was in the Parliament in 8th Assembly when Dogara constituted committee within the House and emphasized that he needed to bring up House Committee on Delegated Legislation and emphasized the role they were supposed to play. But in the Parliament, there's usually what they said, the big committee, and of course the small committees, those one without serious parastatals to oversight. I discovered with the energy he came with regards to the delegated legislation committee, also died with that. There was nothing extraordinary. So, what role was that committee ought to play in oversighting? Meaning, numerous parastatals with delegated legislation, Prof.
I'm aware of that committee because I did some work on them. Now, Dogara is a lawyer. Unfortunately, that's why we're having this lecture, a formal training in legislative drafting, so that you understand the concepts and the legal framework, how these things work. You can't just set up a committee to say all delegated legislation should now come to National Assembly. No. You need to amend the Interpretation Act and other relevant laws, even the Constitution, to make it a requirement. Then you are even changing Nigeria to a parliamentary system of government. In a parliamentary system of government, the difference between parliamentary and presidential is that in parliamentary, ministers are concurrently, notice my choice of words, concurrently. You are a minister, you are also a legislator, a member of parliament. At the same time, in a presidential system, no, there's a distinction. You are either a minister or a legislator. You do not combine the two. And because in a parliamentary system, a minister, don't forget, delegated legislation gives power to a minister to make regulations. And such a minister is already a member of parliament. So it's natural that when he makes any regulation, he brings it to his peers who are also legislators. It's called, the technical word is laying before parliament. All the delegated legislation made by ministers, they table them before parliament. Parliament will debate and approve them. Because in parliamentary system of government, ministers are concurrently members of parliament. But in a presidential system, a minister is not a member of parliament. Therefore, a minister cannot submit his delegated legislation to parliament because he's not a member. He submits it to the Federal Executive Council. Amongst the Federal Executive Council is the Minister of Justice, who has the duty to gazette